If a manufactured food is packed by another entity, which company should an importer review? The food producing company or the packing company? Mr. Pendleton, please.
Manufactured food is merely packed by another entity before that food being exported to the United States. The entity that packs the food would not be the foreign supplier. The foreign supplier would be the manufacturer of the food, and the importer-supplier verification activities would need to be directed and focused on that manufacturer, because the packing is not an activity that would make the food make that entity become the foreign supplier under the definition of foreign supplier in the regulation.
Thank you very much.
Question 43. Food samples in a trade show are subject to FSPP since they are distributed widely. Therefore, the consignee of the sample should act as an importer and check if the samples meet the FSMA standards over the duration of the trade show. That means that even samples only meant for the show or the trade show are subject to prior revision with respect to the product's history in terms of food safety, hazard analysis, and hazard control of the supplier. Is this understanding correct?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but I can talk about, in generally, trade show samples not being exempt from FSVP because we would regard them as being sold or distributed to the public at the trade show. So whether the samples are provided at a trade show by the importer itself or by a subsequent entity, there would need to be a supplier verification by whoever is the importer of those samples under the FSVP regulation. But perhaps that's not, they're asking for something a little bit different, not sure.
So, as I understand, so what you are saying is that food samples and trade show are subject to FSPP. Is that correct?
Yes, generally. Food samples for trade show are subject to FSVP because we would regard them as being sold or distributed to the public. We do have an exemption for food for research or evaluation, and there are certain requirements that a food needs to meet for it to be eligible for that exemption, and they are that the food needs to be not intended for retail sale and not sold or distributed to the public, needs to be labeled with the statement the food is not for research or evaluation use.
You said not.
Oh, okay. These are requirements that need to be met to be eligible for the exemption. Sorry. So it has to be not intended for retail sale and not sold or distributed to the public, has the state labeled as food for research or evaluation use. Sorry about that. It's imported in a small quantity that's consistent with a research or analytic or quality assurance purposes, and the food is used only for that purpose, with whatever is not used being properly disposed of, and it needs to be accompanied at entry with customs with a declaration that the food will be used for this research or evaluation purpose. So those are the criteria that need to be met to be eligible, yes, for the research or evaluation exemption. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Number 44. If our partner owns a farm, is it correct to understand that we should see if it complies with produce safety standards, CGMP, and other FDA rules?
If you're talking about will the FSVP regulations apply to the importation of food from the importer's partner, that somehow there's a corporate affiliation in the foreign country, then yes, it is subject to FSVP. We determined with the final rule that we would not have an exemption for that, but we concluded that it was appropriate to take that relationship into consideration when conducting the requirements under FSVP. So in terms of determining for the importer determining what type of verification it may need to conduct for a particular food from that supplier, it could take into consideration the relationship that it has being in the same corporate structure, and maybe it might conclude that rather than annual on-site auditing, less frequent auditing, or perhaps review of records, or perhaps it could take advantage and rely on in-house auditing that it conducts in helping it to meet its FSVP requirements.
Thank you. Next two questions, 45, 46. I think I will hold these two questions for the afterwards sessions, so I'll skip those. And question 47, what is the advantage if an importer participates in the voluntary qualification import program, BQIP? So advantage, this may not be relevant to your presentation, but may I ask you this question? What is the advantage if an importer participates in VQIP?
Sure, thank you. We issued a draft guidance on how the voluntary qualified importer, or VQIP, would work last summer, and we received many comments about that, and we are considering those comments now. And but we hope that there are several advantages that importers will find attractive to participate in the program, because we believe that the agency could benefit from having, among other benefits that I'll talk about, allowing expedited entry for food for importers that show that they have very robust food safety and security systems, and that will help us to devote our resources elsewhere, because we would have much more confidence in the safety of food from such importers. So among the benefits that we listed in the draft guidance, and of course we received comments on these benefits, but they include, as I mentioned, expedited entry of food into the United States. Basically that would mean immediate release unless examination and sampling are necessary for public health reasons. Any examination and sampling would be limited to for-cause situations, or to obtain risk-based microbiological samples, or in some cases perhaps to audit the FSVP program or the VQIP program. And any examination and sampling would be at the VQIP food destination or at some other location that is preferred by the VQIP participant. VQIP participants would be entitled to expedited lab analysis of those for-cause or audit samples, if we actually did need to conduct those, to the extent that is possible with public health concerns. There will be a help desk established for those that are participating in VQIP to handle any problems that might arise in terms of the expediting of entry of this food at the border. And we will issue a list of VQIP participants and put that on our FDA website. But also, if a participant doesn't want to be publicly listed in that, we will respect those wishes and not include them on the public list. But we think there would be some of those importers that would feel like that is a selling point, that they are eligible for expedited entry of the products that they import.
Thank you very much. The next question, number 48. How frequently would the FDA audit? Does the FDA audit to the foreign suppliers? Could you indicate the scale of the target entity? For example, sales of more than $1 million would be subjected to the audit. And would you estimate the ratio of foreign suppliers in the whole audit plan?
Unfortunately, I'm not. I don't have the information about exactly how we will be fitting inspections of importers into our overall inspection program. Certainly there will be some, and I think that's still being developed as to exactly how we will do that. It will be risk-based. I can say that, as with all of the major components of the FSMA. So we will take into consideration the types of foods and the types of importers when we consider exactly which importers to inspect. Also should note that we, in addition to going on-site, if you will, to the importer, generally that would be where the importer keeps its records, because many importers will not be doing any manufacturing or processing themselves. But we can go inspect the records at where they're kept, but we also have the authority to request that records be sent to us electronically. So, and we hope that that will help us to get a sense of more importers than we could otherwise of how they are complying with FSVP, or with FSVP right. Thank you.
So you already gave a partial answer, but question 49. So could you please show us examples on how an importer reviews document? So can you share with us some specific examples?
Of course, the importer needs to conduct supplier verification activities. That's one of the core requirements for FSVP. And so there would be on-site auditing is going to be one verification activity that will often be conducted. But as I mentioned, there could be an importer might conclude that review of relevant food safety records is an appropriate supplier verification activity. So the importer in that situation might look at copies of production records from a supplier that is subject to preventive controls as a way of meeting its verification requirements. If the supplier is a farm, the importer might look at records of, for example, of use of agricultural water and biological soil amendments. So those are some of the key records that might be reviewed in terms of meeting FSVP requirements. As I also mentioned, the importer can rely on others to both determine and perform appropriate supplier verification activities. So if that happens, the importer needs to review and assess the documents of those activities from whoever is doing it. So we would expect that a qualified individual with expertise in that activity would review those records, and we would expect that they would need to decide whether the conclusions or determinations that are set forth in those documents are reasonable and well-founded and consistent with the FSVP requirements. With respect to the results of verification activities, importers should address whether the results provide adequate assurance that the hazards requiring a control in that food are being significantly minimized or prevented, and if not, you would need to take appropriate corrective action. So those are some types of record review that an importer might need to conduct. I'm not sure exactly whether there's a specific type of record review that the question was going to.
Thank you. Question 49 actually was actually from the perspective of the importer. The previous one, 48, this was in relation to the inspection on foreign supplier. So I think your response actually you talked about what is expected to do conducted by an importer. Is that correct? So you just explained what kind of activities importers are going to conduct, right?
FSVP requirements are for importers, so they wouldn't address what the supplier itself would need to do. But as I mentioned, there are many cases where the importer does need to obtain records and to review them, and they would, including records that document, for example, the foreign supplier's activity.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question. Question number 50. My understanding is that if manufacturing facility is manufacturing hazardous food product which falls into the category of SACODA, if there is such concern, importer must conduct on-site audit. However, what would happen if the importers that don't have the expertise necessary for audit? How will the assessment be made? If there's no expertise, it would be a costly process to hire outside auditor. There may be reluctance to import, or issues may arise as to who will bear the cost. Any countermeasures? And for the approval of the importers, the review of the documents and the records of the suppliers, it would be necessary. And is it necessary to have, I think it is necessary to have the English documents, including the food safety plan and recall plan, but with the supplier documents in English, does it have to be verified by a third party?
The first part, I think, was related to the cost or the burden of an on-site auditing, and as was mentioned, the default procedure when there is a SACODA hazard, a serious hazard in a food, is annual on-site auditing, and we recognize that that would be one of the more robust and possibly expensive types of supplier verification. But as I mentioned, the rule allows for an importer to rely on other entities to actually conduct the audit and obtain the results of the audit, as long as the importer reviews and assesses the results of the audit. That will be some burden itself. We understand that, but we feel that's an appropriate part. And again, there's also the possibility, as I mentioned, if the supplier has a very good compliance and performance record, that perhaps in some situations the importer could conclude that something other than annual on-site auditing is appropriate. So that is a possibility as well. But we recognize that there will be some cost involved with any type of supplier verification, but we feel that is a core part of the FSVP program itself, as well as the supply chain program provisions of preventive control. So we feel that is appropriate. The second part of the question, can you refresh my memory again what that's about, please? Sorry.
So I would like to repeat then. So for giving the approval by the importers, I think there needs to be a review of document and records of the suppliers. And I think that the English documents must be prepared for food safety plan as well as the recall plan, and also the record of implementation. So is it necessary to have the third-party verification of the English documents prepared by the suppliers?
Just to clarify that, as I said, with respect to FSVP as well as with preventive controls, unless except for documents that have to be submitted to FDA, Jenny talked about some of those. What is that for qualified facility? But if you are obtaining documents related to supplier verification, they do not need to be translated into English. For FSVP purposes, you just have your qualified individual who is looking at those documents needs to be able to understand them. If FDA comes to an importer's site and wants to look at certain documents to perhaps if everything is in a language other than English and they want to get a sense of a couple of foods that importer imports, they might ask for translation of some of those documents in a reasonable time frame, but there isn't a requirement that all documents that are maintained for FSVP purposes be translated into English. Again, that was in the proposed rule, but that was one of the things that we did change in the final rule.
Thank you. Question 51. I'd like to know the depth or the extent of FSBP requirement. I'll just give you an example. So the bread or confectionery, there are many works in progress and byproducts. So there are raw materials for these products. So how far should we go? For example, do we have to verify the implementation of the supply chain program as well?
Verify. Well, the short answer is that the importer needs to conduct supplier verification for the foreign supplier, and that is the last entity that does some sort of significant manufacturing or processing to the food before it is exported to the United States. So, and the information then, the verification activity, whether it's on-site auditing of that entity or records, would be about that particular manufacturer or processor. If there is a situation where certain hazards in a food are controlled by some entity previous to the foreign supplier, that, for example, the foreign supplier of raw materials or other ingredients, in those cases, there might be a situation, well, generally the importer does need to get through the supplier or some other entity some information about how that earlier entity in the supply chain addressed that hazard that's not going to be controlled by anybody else. But generally the focus of the importer's supplier verification activities is on the company that does the last significant manufacturing or processing in the foreign country. So, and that's the foreign supplier as defined under the regulation.
Thank you.
Yes.
Number 52. When would the FSVP guidance be published?
We are working hard on that, and we are working closely also, as Jenny mentioned, that they're developing their guidance on preventive controls, and one part of the preventive controls are the supply chain program provisions. We on the FSVP team are working very closely with them, the group that is working on supply chain controls, to write guidance on all these aspects, like what it means to do an appropriate food and supplier review, what it means to, or how you determine what appropriate supplier verifications needed to be conducted for certain types of hazards with certain types of suppliers. So we are working on all those issues and the sub-issues related to that. So it's going to be sometime this year. I don't know exactly when, but we know we need to make that available, because there are many issues that we will hopefully can help provide some clarification about the agency's understanding of them, and we will be looking forward to receiving input from stakeholders about how importers, what they should be expected to do to comply with various provisions in FSVP. So we know that is a very important part of the process, and we will definitely be looking for input and for comments on that draft guidance when it comes out sometime later this year. I wish I knew exactly when right now.
Thank you. Question 53. FDA gets information through inspection, for example. So we'd like to know, to what extent are you disclosing that information? For example, in their case, you may possibly disclose even the technological know-how owned by the company. Is it going to be the case?
No, we certainly hope not to do that. We are bound by...
We will not.
No, we will not do that. There, well, never mind. I was going to say, I have worked on drug matters in the past at FDA, and there was some accidental disclosure of something in the past, and it was very serious. So we know that we need to take every precaution not to do that. We have regulations that address the public disclosure of documents that are presented to us, and those regulations include requirements that exclude from FOIA review the review to the public under the Freedom of Information Act information that are trade secrets or confidential commercial information. So no, we will not be disclosing that any information that we review on those matters as part of our inspection of importers or review of records under the FSVP regulation, that will not be subject to public disclosure.
Thank you very much. So I would like to now take the questions from the audience. If there are any questions, please raise your hand. I see a hand. Thank you very much. Nice to meet you. My company, it does both import and export. So we export to the U.S. and then we import from the U.S. as well. And through the customs, when FSVP rules are determined, would it be necessary to submit the documents? Is there any the documents we need to submit for customs?
Thanks for the question. The only information that the regulation requires at entry is that the importer, the FSVP importer, ensure either itself or whoever is submitting the information about the food to customs to identify that FSVP importer as the importer of the food. So they need to provide their name, an email address, as well as their unique facility identifier for the importer. And that information has to be provided at customs. But that's the only information that has to be provided under the FSVP regulation. As I mentioned, there's not, you don't have to provide any other information about your supplier's compliance with the preventive controls or produce safety regulation if they are subject to them, or you do not have to attest that you are in compliance with FSVP. At entry, no, you do not have to provide that information. The only information related to FSVP that you're providing is that you have to make sure that you are identified as the importer of that food because you fall under the definition of that of importer for that food because you are the U.S. owner or consignee at the time of entry, or if there's not a U.S. owner or consignee, then that you are the U.S. agent or representative of the foreign owner or consignee at the time of entry. But that's it.
Did that answer your question? Yes, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, please. Good afternoon. So thank you for your explanation on FSVP and in your presentation. So regarding the import of goods, so import proceeding, no change in import proceedings, I understand. So if I understand it correctly, so after the implementation of FSVP, even after the implementation, so no change in import speed. So no change. And VQ. So if we participate in BQIP, we can expect even faster import proceedings. Is my understanding correct?
That's correct. Yes. Thank you. So if you, of course, we have in the draft guidance on the voluntary qualified importer program, we specify the information that we would request from potential applicants So they will need to tell us about what they do to ensure that the food that they are importing is safe, and the type of security measures that they use as well. They have to talk about their quality assistance program, how they ensure food safety and security. And if you are approved for participation in the voluntary qualified importer program, then you would be entitled to expedited entry among the other benefits that I talked about. But yes, that will be the approach. And as I think the notice announcing the draft guidance said, we are planning to have up to 200 participants in the first year. So we talked about a program where we could handle that many for the first year. But and as I also said, we're reviewing comments on the draft guidance now. We received a lot of interest and questions about aspects about both the benefits and the costs of participating in it. So we are looking through those comments now, and we'll be issuing the final guidance, I think, sometime later this year.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you.
はい、では
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Please raise your hand if you have any questions. I see a hand. Here, please.
So thank you very much for your presentation. It's very clear. So I understand, trade show sample is subject to FSVP. Is it correct?
Yes, generally yes.
And then which means, when importers import their trading show sample from Japan, they need to check in the compliance whether food suppliers is in compliance with PCHF or whatever, FDA related regulations. It is correct?
Yes, they would need to conduct some verification activities to see, well, if their supplier is subject to preventive controls or produce safety, then yes, they would need to assess whether they are in compliance or using processes and procedures that provide at least the same level of protection as those required under preventive controls or PC.
Okay, thank you. So they may sometimes obtain product records or whatever, the documents, whether the documents showing whether they are in compliance with PCHF or FDA regulations, whatever. So I mean, it seems to be strict to importers and the consignees in the U.S. because that product is not sold at this moment at the entry of the U.S. So they need to request food suppliers. So before which is not yet sell their products in the U.S. at that moment. They may request them to make reports or whatever. So it may seem so very strict.
just wanted to add to this that if the food is not going to be sold or distributed in any way, it's just going to be on display for people to look at, then it could come in as food for research or evaluation, and with all of the caveats that Brian talked about with respect to labeling. But if you would distribute it to someone so they might consume it, then you have to have all the controls.
Thank you.
Any
other questions? Yes, please. So in relation to the question, that previous question, so if it's not go to the end consumers, so as far as it's a just simple sample, how can we prove this? So can we describe as such on an invoice, for example, saying that so these samples are actually out of scope of FSVP. So for example, if we put that information on an invoice, is that regarded as a declaration as such?
Well, you would need to, as I mentioned before, the regulation specifically requires that if you want to be eligible for the exemption for food for research or evaluation use, you would need to label the food with a statement that it's food for research or evaluation use. I think that we're not likely to generally know about that unless if the importer brings in other food for which they do have foreign supplier verification programs. We would look at those. I think it probably would be a good idea to keep some type of documentation to the effect that it's not going to be distributed to the public at the show. It is only going to be made available. But perhaps that's something that we should address in the draft guidance more, to talk about how importers who are going to be bringing in food for trade shows, that just to be on display rather than actually distributed to those who attend the show, can document that, confirm that that was the use of the food rather than to be distributed to the public. So we should, I think, take that under advisement and perhaps address that in the draft guidance. And then if we don't say something or don't say enough in the draft guidance about that issue, then perhaps that's something that you might want to comment on when that does come out.
Thank you for your explanation.
Thank you very much. I would like to take the last question for this session. Any questions? Please. Thank you. Thank you so much for your explanation. There's one thing I would like to confirm. So, through trading companies, we export food to the United States. In those cases, we would be the foreign supplier, and the trading company is the importer. Is my understanding correct? So that's my first question, and I think that would be the case. And in those cases, the importers. So if the importers must supervise us suppliers, foreign suppliers, and at that time there are various information that we need to provide to the importers. So I think there are a lot of confidential information which we don't want to provide. Do we need to provide those kind of confidential information to importers as well?
Just to try to understand, the importer is an entity in the United States. So if there's a U.S. owner or consignee of the food at the time of entry, that's the importer. I wasn't sure if this is a situation where there isn't one, and so that there would need to be a U.S. agent or representative of the foreign owner at the time to serve as the importer and to conduct supplier verification of food, et cetera, to meet the FSVP requirements. The foreign supplier, again, is an entity that does something significant in manufacturing or processing. So a food could go could be a couple entities in the supply chain, and if the last entity is an exporter and they don't do anything significant, they don't do anything that constitutes manufacturing or processing that is other than a small, minimal nature, de minimis nature, then that would not be the foreign supplier. But yes, the importer will, whoever meets that definition, will need to conduct some supplier verification unless there's an exemption. And the supplier verification activities will focus on the foreign supplier, whoever meets that definition. But I'm not sure I addressed all of your questions, so I'm happy to try and follow up if there is not something that I clarified. Oops.
So, for example, within the plant, there are information which are considered confidential, which would not go outside. And in terms of the raw materials, so there are information which we would be able to let out, and also which are confidential. And I wanted to know whether the confidential information which we don't want the outsiders to know must be conveyed to the importers as well, the confidential information.
Yeah, sorry about that. The importer will need to get enough information about how the foreign supplier is controlling the hazard. I think we did talk about in the proposed and final rules that it would, I mean, there may be some suppliers who are reluctant to share some information that might be vital for an importer to complete its FSVP responsibilities to comply with FSVP. But I think if the importer is unable to get the information that it needs to comply with FSVP, then the supplier could not be a supplier for that company. There will need to be agreements. It could affect the contractual relationships with respect to how and exactly what information that the importer is going to obtain from its supplier. But the regulation talks about the nature of information that the importer needs to get about how, in particular, how the hazards are being significantly minimized or prevented by the foreign supplier. And so that there is some information that will be needed for the importer to obtain. But I think Jenny wants to weigh in here.
I think Brian is right in that the importer is going to have to do supplier verification. They're going to have to understand enough about the process to be able to know whether the food is safe. So if the importer is going to have an audit of a facility that is using a novel technology to deliver a microbial kill step, then the auditor is going to have to understand that process well enough to be able to say, yes, the hazard is being controlled. But the auditor would not need to provide information that says, this is the type of equipment they're using and these are the parameters that they are applying in order to ensure that the hazard is controlled. They would just have to acknowledge that they have reviewed the process and it is adequate.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you very much. So it's time for us to stop this session. So that would conclude Mr. Pendleton's session. Thank you very much, Mr. Pendleton.